In the lonely hills of central Texas, where lawmen were scarce and silence stretched for miles, a single doctor's visit uncovered one of the darkest family secrets ever whispered across the frontier. What drive? Samuel Hayes saw that humid March morning of 1854 would haunt him for the rest of his life, and leave behind a trail of burned records, terrified witnesses, and a mystery buried deep in Blanco County soil. Part 1. The Doctor's Visit. The hills of central Texas in 1854 were wild, beautiful, and merciless. Families lived scattered miles apart, bound only by faith and fear. Out here, people handled their own justice, their own burials, and sometimes, their own sins. Dr. Samuel Hayes was a man of science, trained in Philadelphia, calm under pressure, and respected across the hill country. But even a man of reason could not prepare for what awaited him that spring morning when a desperate rider arrived at his door. It was just after dawn when the knock came. A young Mexican ranch hand, sweat-soaked and shaking, handed him a folded note written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Dr. Hayes, your service is required urgently. Medical matter of delicate nature. Josiah Hargrove, Pedernales Ranch. The name struck Hayes immediately. The Hargrove family was known, though not well liked. Josiah Hargrove was a hard, deeply religious man who rarely came to town and never allowed his daughters to be seen. Some whispered that he kept them hidden for their safety. Others said he kept them for darker reasons. Hayes gathered his bag and set out by mid-morning. The journey took 7 long hours under a burning sun, the path winding through cedar thickets and rocky creek beds. He passed no riders, no houses, only the endless hum of cicadas and the occasional distant cry of a hawk. When he finally reached the Hargrove property, dusk was falling. The ranch was larger than he expected, nearly 800 acres, with a sturdy limestone house, a barn, and several outbuildings. Yet the silence was wrong. No barking dogs, no laughter, not even the clatter of livestock. In his journal, preserved years later by his descendants, Drive, Hayes wrote, "The air itself felt heavy, as though the land wished to speak but dared not." Josiah Hargrove met him at the porch. He was tall, lean, with gray in his beard and eyes like cold steel. "You've taken a sacred oath, Doctor," Josiah said before even offering a greeting. "What you see here remains private. God's business is not the world's business." Hayes, accustomed to eccentric frontiersmen, nodded. He assumed there was a difficult childbirth, or perhaps an illness too shameful to speak of. He could never have imagined what waited inside. The house was dark, shutters closed despite the humid air. The smell was faint, soap, herbs, and something metallic beneath it. The floorboards creaked as Josiah led him upstairs to a large room. And then, Hayes saw them. 7 women, all young, all lying in neat rows of beds along the wall. And every one of them visibly pregnant. "My daughters," Josiah said calmly. "All are with child. You will examine them and ensure their health." Hayes froze. His mind rebelled at the sight. The eldest, perhaps late 20s. The youngest, barely 15. Their eyes followed him silently, wide and hollow, as if waiting for permission to breathe. He swallowed hard, forcing professionalism into his voice. "How far along are they?" Josiah's reply chilled him. "They are blessed in different seasons, Doctor. As the Lord sees fit." As he examined each young woman, Hayes noticed the similarities: same pale skin, same freckled cheeks, same trembling hands. But it wasn't just their resemblance that disturbed him. It was the fear, the kind of fear that cannot be faked. One of the girls, Esther, whispered, as he checked her pulse, "Please, help us." Before Hayes could respond, Josiah's heavy boots sounded behind him. "You will speak only when spoken to," he said sharply, and Esther shrank back under the covers. Hayes' blood ran cold. He realized, with a sick certainty, that these were not the patients of a normal physician call. This was something far darker. When the examinations were done, Josiah led him back downstairs. The doctor tried to ask gentle questions. How long had the pregnancies continued? Where were the mothers, husbands? But Josiah brushed him off with scripture. "The Lord provides seed and season," he said, his voice tight. A man of faith need not explain the Lord's miracles to men of science. Hayes left that night uneasy. He rode back to Fredericksburg under a rising moon, the echo of that silent house following him like a shadow. In his journal, he wrote, "Something unnatural grows in that home. I fear not disease of the body, but of the soul." 3 months later, a second message came. Another urgent request from the Hargrove ranch. But this time, it wasn't about childbirth. Something had gone terribly wrong. To be continued in Part 2, The Births. Call to action. If you want to uncover what happened next at the Hargrove Ranch, and the horrifying truth behind those 7 pregnancies, subscribe now, share this story, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. More forgotten tales from the dark corners of American history are waiting to be told. Would you like me to continue with Part 2, The Births, in the same tone and 1,000-word format? Title: The Hargrove Curse, Part 2, The Letter from Ruth. When Dr. Samuel Hayes left the Hargrove Ranch that March evening, he believed he had witnessed the darkest secret a man could hide. But what he didn't know was that the real nightmare was only beginning. Weeks later, a letter arrived, one that confirmed his worst fears and revealed a truth so disturbing, it nearly drove him to madness. Part 2. The Letter from Ruth. Dr. Hayes rode home from the Hargrove Ranch as the sun sank behind the Texas hills, his mind caught between disbelief and horror. 7 sisters, all with child, all silent under the control of a man who called himself righteous. Every glance, every whisper, every tremor in those girls' hands spoke of something too terrible to name. Back in Fredericksburg, Hayes tried to sleep but couldn't. He kept seeing their faces, pale and expressionless. Especially the youngest, Sarah, barely 15, trembling as he examined her pulse. Something inside him screamed that he had to act, but how? In 1854, the Texas frontier was ruled by its own code. A man's home was his kingdom, and the law barely reached the edges of civilization. The next morning, Hayes opened his journal and wrote, "If silence is complicity, then my profession makes cowards of us all." Still, he couldn't ignore what he had seen. He needed guidance, so he went to the one man he trusted with his conscience, Father Klaus Brandt, the Lutheran minister who served the small frontier congregation. They spoke late into the night inside the dim wooden church. Hayes told him everything, except the name. The priest listened carefully, his face grave. In the old country, Father Brandt said softly, this would be handled by law at once. But here, the law is distance. The sheriff cannot act on whispers. Without testimony, there is no crime. The priest placed a hand on Hayes's shoulder. If God brought you there, perhaps he means for you to do something more. But tread carefully, doctor. Men like Josiah Hargrove believe their will is God's will, and that makes them dangerous. 2 days later, Hayes went to Sheriff William Prescott. Prescott was a broad, sunburned man with a casual drawl, and a deep distrust of getting involved in other people's business. "Doc," the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair, "out here a man's home is his castle. Unless one of them girls rides into town and swears out a statement, I can't do a thing." Hayes tried to press him. "Sheriff, this man, he's hurting them. I can't prove it yet, but..." Prescott raised a hand. "I don't deal in guesses, Doc. You bring me witnesses or evidence, I'll act. Until then, it's just gossip, and I don't ride 20 miles through snake country for gossip." Hayes left furious, disgusted by the law's indifference. But he didn't realize that someone else had already taken notice, someone inside the Hargrove home. Weeks passed. Hayes buried himself in his practice, tending to fevers and snakebites, but his mind never strayed far from that house on the Pedernales River. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he thought he heard the faint echo of Sarah's whisper, "Help us." Then, one morning in late April, a familiar voice called his name outside his office. It was Diego Fuentes, the ranch hand who had fetched him weeks earlier. His horse was dusty, his face pale. "Doctor," Diego said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat. "I was told to bring this to you. Paid well for it, told to wait a month before delivering. Said you'd understand." The paper was creased and smudged, the handwriting delicate but hurried. It was unsigned, but Hayes recognized the careful, educated hand immediately. "Dr. Hayes, If you are reading this, then I have succeeded in bringing you here, and you have seen what no outsider has witnessed. I am the eldest. I write this in secret, knowing discovery means punishment. We are not free to speak. He watches always. We have no husbands, no suitors, only him. The isolation is our prison. The law will not protect us. If you are a man of conscience, find a way to help. We cannot help ourselves. R.H. Hayes read it 3 times, his heart pounding. R.H. Ruth Hargrove. The eldest daughter. The one who had looked calm, almost resigned, during his visit. She had risked everything to tell him the truth. He ran straight to Sheriff Prescott's office, the letter trembling in his hands. Now will you act? Hayes demanded. You see it in her own words. She's begging for help. Prescott frowned and took the letter. He read it slowly, then exhaled through his nose. This letter ain't signed, Doc. Could have been written by anybody. It don't name names. Don't accuse no one direct. She's afraid, Hayes snapped. She's trying to survive in a house ruled by fear. Can't you see that? The sheriff shook his head. I see a lot of things, but the law don't work on seeing. You want me to ride onto a man's property, accuse him of something like that, based on this? You'd have a war on your hands. And when it's over, there'll be no law left at all. Hayes slammed his fist on the desk. Then what's the point of having law at all? Prescott met his glare with tired eyes. Out here, the law comes second to survival. I can't fight ghosts, Doc. Hayes left the office shaking with anger. He returned home and poured himself whiskey, staring at the flickering oil lamp on his desk. He thought about Ruth's courage, about Sarah's downcast eyes, about the unnatural silence of that house. He realized something then: the kind of evil he had witnessed could not be stopped by law or sermon. It would take something else. In his next journal entry, Hayes wrote, I fear I am now part of this story, whether I wish it or not. The house on the Pedernales hides more than sin. It hides despair so deep it could poison the land itself. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. That same night, 6 miles from the Hargrove ranch, Diego Fuentes heard screams echoing through the cedar trees. When he rode to the edge of the property at dawn, he saw smoke rising from the main house. Something terrible had begun. To be continued in Part 3, The Births. Call to action. If you want to know what happened after that letter, and what Diego Fuentes discovered at the Hargrove Ranch, subscribe now, share this story, and tell me where you're listening from. Your support helps bring more forgotten American mysteries to light. Would you like me to continue with Part 3, The Births, in the same chilling tone and 1,000-word YouTube-optimized style? Title: The Hargrove Curse, Part 3, The Births. Hook. In the summer of 1854, the quiet hills of central Texas hid a secret darker than sin. When Dr. Samuel Hayes returned to the Hargrove Ranch to deliver 2 children, he carried more than his medical tools. He carried the truth that could destroy a man's name and reveal the unthinkable evil behind those shuttered windows. What he and a midwife witnessed that night would shock even the most hardened frontier soul. Part 3. The Births. Dr. Hayes couldn't escape the memory of that letter, the shaky handwriting, the silent plea from Ruth Hargrove. He had gone to the sheriff, to the church, even to the law itself, but everywhere he turned, he found the same wall: a man's home is his own kingdom. Texas law in 1854 left little room for mercy. Women were property of their fathers until marriage. Crimes inside a home were family matters. And what Ruth had described wasn't just sin, it was something the law refused to name. But Hayes refused to turn away. He began asking quiet questions around Fredericksburg, seeking anyone who remembered the Hargrove family before they vanished from public life. The stories he uncovered painted a grim picture. A merchant named Herman Fisher remembered the early years. When they first came, Fisher said, Josiah was just another preacher farmer. His wife, Martha, was quiet but decent. But after each daughter was born, she came to town less and less. By 49, after the last girl, she didn't come at all. Fisher leaned closer. Then came the wall. Not a real one, mind you, but Josiah started saying the outside world was sinful. Bought extra supplies, stopped letting the girls attend church. Said God had called him to keep them pure. A widow, Mrs. Clara Vogel, shared a similar memory. I saw Martha once at church, back in 48. She looked beaten down, though I saw no bruises. Just the eyes of a woman who's given up. When I tried to comfort her, she smiled and said, "We must submit to the authority God has placed over us." Those were her exact words. I've never forgotten them. The isolation had begun years earlier, and now, in 1854, it was complete. The Hargrove daughters had known no one but their father for half a decade. That summer, two of the daughters, Ruth and Naomi, went into labor only days apart. Josiah sent for Dr. Hayes again. This time, Hayes did not go alone. He insisted on bringing a midwife, Mrs. Elizabeth Chambers, a sharp, strong-willed widow who had delivered babies for nearly 40 years. Josiah protested, but Hayes stood firm. "Two births at once require two pairs of hands," he said. "She comes with me, or I do not come at all." Josiah reluctantly agreed. The two rode out together on July 18, 1854. As they approached the ranch, the place seemed even more lifeless than before. No voices, no laughter, only the wind whistling through dry mesquite. Inside, the house was stifling. The shutters were still closed, and the smell of sickness and sweat hung thick in the air. Ruth was already in heavy labor. Naomi's contractions had begun that morning. Hayes and Mrs. Chambers divided their duties. He would attend Ruth, she would assist Naomi. But soon, they realized they were witnessing something far worse than difficult childbirth. Mrs. Chambers, keen-eyed and experienced, noticed what Hayes had missed before. The locks, on the outside of the upstairs bedroom doors. The absence of shoes on the girls' feet. Their eyes, always fixed on the floor when Josiah entered the room. "They're barefoot," she whispered to Hayes when he passed her in the hall. "Makes it harder to run." As night fell, Ruth's cries filled the house. The labor stretched into the next morning. She called out for her mother, begged God to take her pain, and at one point screamed words that froze everyone in the room. "No more, Father. Please, no more." Josiah stood in the doorway, face unreadable. Mrs. Chambers stopped moving for a moment, her hand pressed to her chest. Hayes looked up from his instruments, and in that instant, they both understood. Ruth wasn't praying. She was pleading with the man in the doorway. When the baby finally came, a weak, pale boy, Ruth wept uncontrollably. Josiah's expression twisted in a strange mix of pride and fury. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked out. Hours later, Naomi gave birth to a girl. When the infant was placed in her arms, Naomi didn't smile. She looked at the child with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "Another girl. He'll be disappointed." Mrs. Chambers couldn't stay silent. "Child," she said gently, "who is the father of this baby?" Naomi hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the doorway where Josiah again stood listening. Her answer was quiet, deliberate. "The father is the man who rules this house," she said. Then, meeting the midwife's gaze with desperate honesty, she added, "I have known no other man." The room fell silent. Hayes felt his knees weaken. There was no longer room for doubt. The truth, so carefully hidden beneath scripture and isolation, had spoken for itself. By dawn, both mothers slept, exhausted. Josiah gave brief thanks to God for their blessings, and demanded that Hayes and Mrs. Chambers leave immediately. Outside, as they mounted their horses, Chambers finally spoke. Her face was pale with fury. "Dr. Hayes, in 40 years, I've never seen such wickedness. Those girls are prisoners. What's being done to them?" She stopped, unable to finish. Hayes nodded grimly. "I know. I saw it the first time, but I couldn't prove it. Now we can." They rode back to Fredericksburg in silence, the morning sun burning through the fog. When they reached town, they went straight to Sheriff Prescott. The sheriff listened, pacing behind his desk. When they finished, he sighed. "It's ugly, no doubt about that. But the law don't have a word for it, Doctor. The girls would have to testify, and you saw they're too scared. Legally, he's within his rights to keep them there." Mrs. Chambers stood up, trembling with anger. "Rights? What about their rights, Sheriff? Their humanity. Prescott looked ashamed but helpless. Ma'am, I don't make the laws. I just enforce 'em. For days, Hayes refused to rest. He spoke with ministers, merchants, and lawyers, but none could offer a path forward. Then came a flicker of hope. A young lawyer named Benjamin Yates, recently arrived from Austin. The law may be silent, Yates said, but not blind. There's an old principle called parens patriae, the state's duty to protect those who cannot protect themselves. If we can convince a judge that those women are being held against their will, we might get a writ of habeas corpus. It was a long shot, but Hayes and Chambers signed sworn statements. Yates prepared the petition and brought it before Judge Thomas Kerrigan, an older man known for his fairness. After a long silence, the judge spoke. I will not issue a full writ yet, but I will authorize the sheriff to inspect the Hargrove property. He will take you, Drive, Hayes, and Counselor Yates. You will see those daughters with your own eyes. It was more hope than they'd ever had. On August 15, 1854, the small party rode toward the Hargrove ranch. Hayes, Chambers, Yates, and Sheriff Prescott, armed with the judge's order. When they arrived, they found the house strangely open. Shutters thrown wide, smoke rising from the chimney. Josiah stepped out onto the porch. His face was calm, almost pleasant. Sheriff, he said softly, I had a feeling you'd come. Doctor, Hayes couldn't keep his curiosity to himself, could he? There was no anger in his tone. Only something worse, acceptance. As if he already knew what awaited them inside. To be continued in Part 4, the inspection. Call to action. If you want to know what Sheriff Prescott and Dr. Hayes discovered inside that house, subscribe now, share this story, and tell me where you're watching from. The next part reveals what really waited behind those open doors, and why no one in Texas ever forgot the name Hargrove. Would you like me to continue with Part 4? The inspection in the same dark historical tone, written in 1,000 words for your YouTube audience. Hook. The August sun beat down on the Texas prairie, but as the sheriff's party approached the Hargrove ranch, the air grew unnaturally cold. Even the horses seemed uneasy, their ears twitching at every rustle of wind. Dr. Hayes had returned to the place that had haunted his dreams for months, but this time, he wasn't alone. With the law on his side and witnesses at his back, he hoped to finally uncover the full truth. But what waited behind those limestone walls would be worse than anything he had imagined. Part 4. Josiah Hargrove stood on the porch, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His calmness was eerie, unnatural, as if he had been expecting their arrival. Sheriff Prescott, Attorney Yates, Drive, Hayes, and Mrs. Chambers exchanged uncertain glances. Something about Josiah's composure felt wrong. It was not the fear of a guilty man caught, but the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. Afternoon light spilled across the yard, and for the first time, Hayes noticed small crosses planted near the fence line, 7 of them. The sight sent a chill down his spine. They looked too fresh, the earth too recently disturbed. He opened his mouth to ask, but Josiah spoke first. Come in, gentlemen. And you too, ma'am, he said with a faint smile. No need to stand out there in the sun. The Lord welcomes all visitors who come in peace. His voice was pleasant, almost soothing, but Hayes could sense the threat beneath the politeness. The group followed him inside, their boots echoing on the stone floor. The air inside was heavy and still, thick with the smell of herbs and smoke. Candles burned along the walls even though daylight still streamed through the windows. Mrs. Chambers was the first to notice something strange. The main hallway, once silent and empty, now had voices coming from behind the closed doors. She could hear muffled weeping, a low hum of prayer, and the faint cry of a baby. Hayes's heart began to race. Where are your daughters, Mr. Hargrove? Prescott asked, his voice steady but firm. Josiah turned slowly toward him. They are where they belong, Sheriff. Safe under my roof, as the good book commands. You've come to check on their welfare, haven't you? You'll find them, well cared for. Yates stepped forward, producing the document signed by Judge Kerrigan. By order of the court, we are here to confirm the safety of your daughters and to ensure they are not being held against their will. You are required to let us speak to them privately. Josiah's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile remained. Of course, he said softly, if that's what the law requires. He gestured down the hall. You'll find Ruth in the front room. Naomi is upstairs with her newborn. The others are tending to the babies. Hayes froze. Babies. Josiah nodded. 3 born in the last 2 months. Blessed children, each one a gift from heaven. The doctor's blood ran cold. 3 newborns. That meant at least 3 of the 7 daughters had already given birth since his last visit. Sheriff Prescott gave a curt nod. We'll speak to Ruth first. Josiah stepped aside. As you wish, Sheriff. I'll be right here should you need anything. Mrs. Chambers led the way to the parlor. When she opened the door, the smell of sickness hit them instantly. Ruth sat by the window, pale and thin, her arms cradling an infant wrapped in a tattered quilt. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, until she saw Dr. Hayes. Doctor, she whispered, her voice trembling. You came back. Hayes knelt beside her. Yes, Ruth, and I brought help. You're safe now. Tears welled in her eyes. Safe, she repeated softly. He doesn't let us be safe. Not even for a moment. Mrs. Chambers gently took the baby and examined her. The child was underweight but breathing steadily. Ruth's hands shook as she clasped her knees, as though trying to keep herself from falling apart. Attorney Yates spoke quietly. Ruth, the judge has authorized us to remove you and your sisters from this property if you wish to leave. Do you understand? Ruth's lips trembled. She looked toward the door. He's listening, she whispered. He always listens. Prescott glanced back into the hallway. Josiah still stood there, his shadow long across the floor. Yates raised his voice slightly. Sheriff, we need privacy to speak with this woman. Prescott nodded and stepped out into the hall. Mr. Hargrove, I'll ask you to wait outside while we conduct our inquiries. Josiah's expression didn't change, but his tone hardened. You think I'm afraid of your papers and your talk of rights? You are trespassing in God's domain, gentlemen. These are my daughters, my responsibility, my covenant. Prescott's hand rested on his revolver. The judge gave me authority to enter this house, Josiah. You stand in my way, and I'll take that as obstruction of justice. A long silence followed. Then Josiah smiled again and slowly stepped onto the porch. Inside, the group exhaled. Ruth began to cry quietly, her sobs shaking her frail frame. You don't understand, she said. He won't let us go. Even if you take us away, he'll come for us. He says the Lord speaks through him, that the world outside is cursed. He says anyone who leaves this house dies in sin. Hayes took her hand. You don't have to live like this anymore, Ruth. We can protect you and your sisters. Her eyes flicked up to his, filled with both hope and terror. You can't protect us, she whispered. Not from him, not from what he's done. Before Hayes could ask what she meant, a scream tore through the house. It came from upstairs, Naomi's room. Everyone jumped to their feet. Prescott drew his gun and charged up the stairs, Hayes and Mrs. Chambers close behind. They burst into the room, and what they saw froze them in place. Naomi lay on the floor, her body twisted, her newborn wailing beside her. Standing over her was Josiah, his face wild, his shirt spattered with blood. You will not take what is mine, he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Prescott fired a warning shot. Drop the knife, Josiah. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then Josiah slowly turned, smiling, a cold, unnatural smile. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, he said. Then he lunged. The gunshot that followed was deafening. When the smoke cleared, Josiah Hargrove lay motionless on the floor, the knife still clutched in his hand. Naomi sobbed, clutching her baby as Hayes rushed to her side. Mrs. Chambers fell to her knees, whispering a prayer. Downstairs, Ruth screamed as the echo of the gunshot reached her. The house, once so silent, was now filled with cries, shouts, and the sound of shattering glass. Outside, the evening wind began to rise, howling across the open prairie like a warning. The curse of the Hargrove house had been broken, or so they thought. Because even as Josiah's body grew still, something in that house seemed to wake. And before the night was over, the rescuers would discover that death was not the end of Josiah Hargrove's rule. Would you like me to continue with Part 5 next? The haunting aftermath and strange occurrences at the ranch. Hook. The bullet that ended Josiah Hargrove's life should have brought peace to that cursed house. But peace never came. That night, as the sheriff's men prepared to leave with the surviving daughters, something began to stir within those stone walls. The air grew heavy, the lights flickered, and a sound like distant chanting echoed from nowhere. Dr. Hayes had thought the horror ended with Josiah's death, but the true nightmare was only beginning. Part 5. The sun had already set by the time Sheriff Prescott ordered his men to secure the ranch. Josiah's body lay covered by a sheet in the upstairs hallway, a crimson stain spreading beneath it. The surviving daughters were gathered in the parlor under Mrs. Chambers' care, their faces pale, eyes wide with shock. The youngest clung to each other, whispering prayers under their breath. Dr. Hayes moved from room to room, checking on Naomi and the newborns. The air inside the house felt wrong, too still, too silent except for the creaking of the old timbers. Even the fire in the hearth burned weakly, as if struggling for air. Sheriff Prescott stood by the window, his jaw tight. "We'll take the girls to town in the morning," he said quietly. "No sense traveling through the prairie at night. Too dangerous." Hayes nodded, but his nerves were frayed. "Then no one should be left alone," he said. "This house, it feels alive." Prescott gave him a tired look. "You've seen too much blood today, Doc. The mind plays tricks after a shooting." But Mrs. Chambers wasn't so sure. She had been sitting with the daughters when she heard it first, a low humming sound coming from upstairs, rhythmic, like a man praying. "Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling, "is anyone upstairs?" Prescott frowned. "Just my deputy keeping watch over the body." At that moment, the deputy appeared in the doorway, his face ashen. "Sir," he said, "you'd better come quick." They followed him up the stairs, the wood groaning beneath their boots. When they reached the landing, the sheet covering Josiah's body was gone. The floor where he'd lain was empty except for a dark smear of blood leading toward the end of the hall. Prescott drew his gun. "Who moved the body?" The deputy shook his head. "I swear, Sheriff, I didn't touch it. I was sittin' right there by the door. I just turned to check the window, and when I looked back, he was gone." Mrs. Chambers gasped, clutching the railing. "That's not possible. He was dead. I saw him die." Hayes knelt, examining the blood trail. It led toward the cellar door at the far end of the hallway. A faint sound came from below, a slow, dragging noise. The kind of sound made by something heavy being pulled across the floor. Prescott motioned for silence and opened the door. A wave of cold, damp air rushed out. He aimed his lantern down the stairs. The light barely reached the bottom, but there was movement, something shifting in the shadows. "Stay here," he ordered. Hayes grabbed his arm. "You can't go down. They're alone." The sheriff nodded once, and both men descended, the lantern flickering with each step. The cellar smelled of earth and rot. Wooden shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars and old tools. The blood trail continued toward the back, ending at a wooden door half buried in the dirt wall. Prescott lifted the lantern higher. Carved into the wood were strange markings, crosses, circles, and letters that looked like scripture written backward. "What in God's name?" Hayes whispered. The sheriff pushed the door open, and the light spilled inside. The space beyond was small and dark, a crude chamber dug into the earth. And there, slumped against the wall, was Josiah's body, eyes open, mouth twisted in what looked like a smile. His hands were folded on his chest as if in prayer. But it wasn't the sight of the corpse that made Hayes step back. It was what lay beside it, a book, bound in cracked leather, open on the dirt floor. Its pages were covered in a mix of Latin and scripture, written over and over again, but distorted, rearranged. The title page read, "The Testament of Dominion." Prescott leaned closer. "Looks like some kind of Bible." Hayes shook his head. "No, it's something else." He turned a page, his hand trembling. "These are rituals, prayers twisted into commands." He believed he could bind his family through scripture. A sudden noise behind them made them whirl around. The cellar door had slammed shut. The lantern flickered violently, and then, darkness. "Prescott," Hayes whispered. "I'm here," came the reply. "Hold on." Then, from the far corner, came a whisper, low and guttural. A voice that was not Josiah's, but sounded like him. "You cannot take what belongs to me." The lantern flared back to life, revealing the cellar empty, Josiah's body gone once again. Hayes and the sheriff stumbled up the stairs, bursting back into the hallway. The daughters were screaming downstairs. "Mrs. Chambers shouted, the windows. They're all slamming shut." They rushed into the parlor. Every door and window had closed on its own, trapping them inside. The room felt colder now, the air heavy with a scent of smoke and earth. The candles along the mantel flickered violently, though there was no wind. Ruth was on her knees, clutching her baby and praying aloud. "He won't leave us," she cried. "He said even death can't separate him from his children." Hayes grabbed her shoulders. "Ruth, listen to me. Your father is gone. Whatever you think you hear, it's not him." But the moment he spoke, the fire in the hearth roared to life, tall and red, casting long shadows that twisted across the walls. In those shadows, they saw him, Josiah's silhouette, standing behind the flames, smiling. "Mrs. Chambers screamed. The daughters wailed as the fire flared higher. Prescott raised his revolver and fired into the shadows, the gunshots echoing through the house. But when the smoke cleared, there was nothing there. Then, silence. The windows burst open all at once, letting in the cold night air. The fire died to embers. The smell of earth faded. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Hayes whispered, "He's not alive, but he's not gone either." Prescott holstered his gun, sweat dripping down his face. "We're leaving. Tonight. Everyone out." No one argued. They gathered the daughters, wrapped the newborns in blankets, and left that cursed house behind. As they rode away, Hayes looked back one last time. In the upper window, just for a second, he saw a figure standing, tall, still, watching. And in that moment, he knew, Josiah Hargrove's evil hadn't died in that house. It had simply changed form. Something unseen now owned the land, and it was waiting. Would you like me to continue with part 6, where the haunted aftermath spreads beyond the ranch and the strange curse begins to touch the nearby town? Hook. By dawn, the Hargrove house stood silent under a blood-red sky. Sheriff Prescott and his men thought they had escaped the nightmare, but evil has a way of following those who disturb its rest. The prairie was quiet that morning, too quiet. Horses refused to move. The newborns wailed endlessly. And deep within the ashes of the Hargrove estate, something ancient and hungry began to breathe again. Part 6. The small town of Waverly was waking up when Sheriff Prescott's wagon rolled in. The people gathered in the square, whispering as they saw the survivors, 5 pale daughters, a trembling widow, drive. Hayes covered in dirt and ash. No one spoke of what had happened in that house. They didn't need to. The fear traveled faster than words. Reverend Collins met them at the steps of the church. "Sheriff," he said softly, "what happened out there?" Prescott removed his hat. "The Hargrove family is finished," he said. "But I can't explain what I saw." No man could. The Reverend looked toward the wagon, where Naomi and the children sat wrapped in blankets. "We'll give them shelter here," he said. "God's house will protect them." But even he didn't sound sure. Dr. Hayes stayed behind at the sheriff's office, his mind restless. The book they'd found in the cellar, the Testament of Dominion, still haunted him. He had it locked away in his satchel, wrapped in cloth, but he could feel it, like it pulsed faintly, as though alive. He sat at the desk, staring at it. The words Josiah had spoken in the cellar echoed in his mind, "You cannot take what belongs to me." Outside, a storm was building. The wind carried strange whispers that rattled the window panes. Hayes rose and lit a lamp, but the flame burned blue. His heart pounded. That night, the first sign appeared. Reverend Collins awoke to the sound of bells. The church's tower bell was ringing on its own. When he climbed the stairs, he found the rope untouched. But the bell swung wildly, as if struck by invisible hands. He looked down through the tower window and saw figures standing in the churchyard, shadowy outlines, unmoving. For a moment, he thought they were townsfolk. Then lightning flashed, and his blood ran cold. The shapes were not people. They were hollow, black forms with eyes like burning coals. By morning, the entire town was whispering about strange happenings. Livestock found dead, water turning thick and dark, children waking up screaming, and at the center of it all, the Hargrove daughters. Mrs. Chambers came running to Dr. Hayes that afternoon. "They're not right," she said. "The girls, they don't blink. They don't speak unless it's together. And their voices," her words broke off as she shivered. "Their voices sound like their father's." Hayes hurried to the church. Inside, he found the girls sitting in a row beneath the altar, their eyes fixed on the cross. Naomi stood nearby, pale and trembling. "Doctor," she whispered, "they pray all day and night. The Reverend says it's devotion. But I hear them saying his words, the same twisted verses Josiah used to mutter before he went mad." Hayes knelt before the eldest daughter, Ruth. "Ruth," he said gently, "do you know who I am?" She blinked once. "You helped deliver us," she said. Her voice was flat, cold. "Father says you were chosen." Hayes froze. "Your father is gone, Ruth." Her eyes narrowed. "Father never leaves. He walks in dreams now. He said you took something from him." Before Hayes could reply, one of the babies began to cry. The sound was shrill and sharp, and suddenly, every candle in the church went out. The door slammed shut. The air turned icy. Then came the whisper. A man's voice, crawling through the dark. "Give it back." Hayes's hands trembled. He reached for his satchel, realizing the voice wasn't coming from the air, it was coming from the book. "Naomi," he said, "we have to burn it." But as he opened the bag, the Testament of Dominion burst open on its own. Pages flapped wildly, and a low moan filled the church. The cross above the altar began to bend, metal groaning as if under great pressure. The Reverend rushed forward with a Bible in hand. "In the name of the Lord, I cast you out," he shouted. The air exploded with sound. Every window shattered at once, sending glass flying. A force threw him back against the pews. Naomi screamed, clutching the babies. The daughters didn't move. They just sat there, smiling faintly, as the church filled with thick, swirling smoke. Hayes grabbed the book and ran for the door. When he threw it open, the night outside was red, like fire reflected in water. He ran to the square and hurled the book into the well. It hit the water with a hiss, steam rising as though he'd dropped something burning. And then, silence. The air grew still again. Inside the church, the smoke cleared. The Reverend lay unconscious but alive. The daughters blinked, confused, as if waking from a dream. Naomi wept in relief. Hayes leaned against the well, breathing hard. "It's over," he whispered. But the well whispered back. A faint, echoing laugh rose from the depths, a man's laugh, deep and mocking. From that night on, Waverly changed. The crops withered. The animals refused to drink from the well. The daughters grew quiet and pale, their eyes always drifting toward the horizon, as if watching something no one else could see. Dr. Hayes knew the truth. He hadn't destroyed the curse. He had only given it a new home. And beneath the ground, in the darkness of that well, Josiah Hargrove was waiting. Would you like me to continue with Part 7, where the curse begins to spread through Waverly, turning the entire town against itself? Hook. The town of Waverly thought the nightmare had ended when the Hargrove house burned to ash. But evil doesn't vanish, it waits. And now, it had found a new voice beneath the quiet streets and darkened wells of the Texas hills. Something was spreading, something unseen. The curse of Josiah Hargrove had not died. It had simply changed its shape. Part 7. It began with the dreams. Within a week of the fire, half the townsfolk were waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, their hearts racing. They all described the same dream, standing at the edge of a black well, hearing a man whisper their name from below. The sheriff called it nerves. The Reverend called it temptation. But drive. Hayes knew better. He had seen too much already. One evening, as the sun fell red over the prairie, Hayes visited Naomi Hargrove and her sisters at the small parsonage beside the church. The place smelled of candles and dried herbs. The girls were quiet, sitting by the window, sewing in perfect silence. "Naomi," he said softly, "how have they been?" She hesitated. "They sleep little. They speak even less. But sometimes, she looked down, her voice trembling. Sometimes they all hum the same song in their sleep. A hymn father used to sing. Hayes felt a chill. And the book? Gone, she whispered. But at night, I still hear pages turning. Even when no one is near. He wanted to believe it was grief, or guilt. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something from that book had attached itself to them, to the town itself. That night, Hayes wrote in his journal. Whatever Josiah awakened in that house is not bound by fire or distance. It clings to the living, feeding on their fear. The next morning, a rancher named Clyde Drummond rode into town, his horse foaming with exhaustion. He burst into the sheriff's office shouting, "They're all gone. My wife, my boys, all gone." Prescott grabbed his gun. "Gone where?" Clyde shook his head, eyes wide. "They went down to the creek yesterday. I found their clothes, but no one came back." By noon, a search party had formed. The men followed the creek until it bent toward the old Hargrove land. And there, half buried in the mud, they found the Drummond family's footprints, ending at the edge of a sinkhole that hadn't been there before. From inside that hole came a faint, echoing cry. A baby's cry. No one dared go closer. That night, the Reverend held a prayer gathering in the church. People came carrying lanterns and Bibles, desperate for safety. Naomi sat in the front pew, clutching her rosary. Her sisters beside her didn't move, their faces pale as moonlight. Reverend Collins raised his hands. "The Lord protects those who believe. Whatever darkness has touched this land, we shall drive it out." The candles flickered violently. The doors creaked. Then Ruth Hargrove stood up. Her voice cut through the silence. "He is already here, Reverend." Everyone turned. Her eyes were black, bottomless. Naomi screamed, "Ruth, sit down." But Ruth only smiled. "Father walks again. He promised he would find us." Every window shattered at once. The candles blew out. The church plunged into darkness. People ran, stumbling and shouting. Hayes grabbed Naomi's arm and dragged her toward the exit, but she resisted. "The children," she cried, pointing toward the altar where the two babies lay in baskets. Hayes ran back. As he reached for them, a figure appeared behind the altar, tall, shadowed, with burning eyes. Josiah Hargrove. His voice was deep, hollow, echoing through the church. "You took my word," he said. "Now I take yours." Hayes backed away, clutching the children. "You're dead," he whispered. Josiah's grin widened. "Death is just another sermon, Doctor. And I have many left to preach." He raised his hand. The walls shook. The crucifix above the altar bent backward, snapping in two. Naomi rushed forward, shouting prayers, her voice cracking with terror. Ruth turned her head sharply toward her. "He says you betrayed us," she said. "He says your faith is a lie." Hayes ran for the door, carrying the babies. Outside, the storm was raging. Lightning split the sky in two. He looked back and saw the church roof ignite in flames, though no lightning had struck it. Naomi staggered out moments later, coughing, her face streaked with ash. "My sisters," she gasped, "they stayed inside." Hayes held her back. "You can't save them." The church burned through the night. People watched from a distance, too afraid to intervene. The flames were strangely silent, no sound of wood cracking, no screams, only a deep, humming tone that vibrated through the air like 1,000 voices praying in reverse. When morning came, the fire was out. The church was gone. The altar was reduced to ash. Yet somehow, the cross stood untouched, upright, blackened, but solid. In the center of the ruins, where the altar once stood, was a circle of wet earth. A new well had formed overnight. Sheriff Prescott looked at it, pale and shaking. "No one goes near that thing," he said. "Ever." But by sundown, a child had disappeared. By the end of the week, 2 more were gone. Dr. Hayes, desperate, turned to his journals, trying to trace the words Josiah had once written in the margins of the Testament of Dominion. There was a passage about the circle of living water, and the 7 vessels through which the covenant endures. It struck him like thunder. The daughters were the vessels. The curse wasn't over because they were still alive. He slammed the book shut. "We have to leave," he told Naomi. "You and the babies. Tonight." Naomi nodded weakly. But where would we go? Hayes looked out toward the horizon, where the sun was sinking behind the dark hills. As far from this land as possible. Because if we stay, the next time Josiah calls from that well, we might all answer. But as they packed their things, Naomi froze. From the corner of the room came a small, delicate voice. It was one of the babies. Whispering, "Father's waiting." Hayes felt his blood run cold. He turned slowly, and saw the baby smiling. "Would you like me to continue with part 8, Ware Drive?" Hayes and Naomi try to escape Waverly, only to discover the curse has already spread beyond the town's borders. Hook. When Dr. Hayes and Naomi fled Waverly under the blood-red dawn, they thought they were leaving the horror behind. But some evils aren't bound to a place, they cling to the living. And as the road stretched before them, they began to realize the curse of Josiah Hargrove wasn't just following them. It was inside them. Part 8. The first 2 days passed in uneasy silence. Hayes drove the wagon while Naomi sat beside him, clutching the 2 infants wrapped in worn quilts. The road west was empty, the air thick with dust and heat. Every mile between them and Waverly felt like a small victory, but Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. At night, they made camp near a dry creek bed. Naomi rarely slept. Sometimes, in the flicker of firelight, Hayes saw her humming softly to the children, an old hymn from her childhood. But then one night, she stopped mid-song and stared at the flames. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Hayes paused. The wind was still. The only sound was the crackle of fire. "It's him," she said suddenly, her voice shaking. "He's calling again." Hayes tried to reassure her. "Naomi, it's just the wind." But deep in the quiet, he heard it too, a low hum, faint but unmistakable. It came from the earth itself, like a voice buried under miles of soil. That night, Naomi dreamed of home, the limestone house, the locked doors, the dark well behind the barn. She saw her father standing at its edge, whispering her name. When she woke, the fire was dead, and the children were gone. She screamed, waking Hayes. They searched in every direction, shouting the children's names. Finally, they found them, lying beside the wagon, both wide awake, their eyes open and black as coal. Naomi dropped to her knees. "Oh God," she sobbed, "please, not them too." Hayes examined the children, but they seemed unharmed. Still, he noticed something that made his stomach twist, mud under their fingernails, damp and cold. He didn't say a word. He just packed their things and urged the horses forward before the sun rose. By the 4th day, they reached a small settlement called Marlowe's Crossing. It was little more than a few cabins, a trading post, and a half-built church. The townsfolk looked weary but kind. A woman named Esther Pike offered them shelter in her barn. "You're welcome to stay the night," she said. "But folks around here don't travel much after dark. Bad luck, they say." Hayes managed a thin smile. "Bad luck is something we've seen plenty of." That evening, Esther invited them in for supper. Her husband, Samuel, was a quiet man with kind eyes. They asked no questions, though they noticed Naomi's trembling hands and Hayes's haunted stare. But during the meal, one of the children laughed, a strange, sharp sound that made everyone freeze. It wasn't the laugh of a baby. It sounded older, almost mocking. Samuel set down his cup. "That child all right, doctor?" Hayes forced a smile. "Just tired, I think." But inside, his heart pounded. Because the sound, the pitch, the rhythm, was identical to Josiah Hargrove's laugh. That night, Hayes couldn't sleep. He sat near the barn door, staring at the sky. The stars shimmered faintly through the haze. Naomi was inside, trying to calm the babies, but every few minutes he heard them crying in unison, soft at first, then louder, until it sounded like dozens of voices crying together. He walked outside to clear his head. That's when he noticed something strange, the well near the barn. He hadn't seen it earlier. It wasn't part of the settlement's plans, and yet there it was, old and covered in moss, as though it had always been there. He moved closer. The air around it was unnaturally cold. From inside came a faint dripping sound. Then, something else. A whisper. "Hayes." He froze. The voice was unmistakable. "Josiah." Hayes stumbled backward, his heart racing. But when he turned, he saw Naomi standing behind him, her face pale in the moonlight. "You heard him too," she said softly. "Yes," Hayes whispered. "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, one of the babies began to cry. The other joined in, their voices rising until the night filled with that strange, echoing wail. And from the well, something answered. A deep, rumbling moan shook the ground beneath them. The boards of the barn creaked. The horses screamed and reared. Naomi clutched the children, tears streaming down her face. "He's coming," she cried. "He's coming for them." Hayes grabbed her arm. "We run now or we die here." They fled toward the wagon, but as Hayes climbed aboard, he saw Esther Pike standing on her porch, watching them with blank eyes. Her husband stood beside her, the same empty stare on his face. Then, one by one, the other townsfolk emerged from their homes, all silent, all staring toward the well. Naomi whispered, "He's taken them." Hayes snapped the reins, and the horses bolted. Behind them, the ground split open with a deafening crack. The well erupted in a burst of black water, spraying into the night sky. For a moment, Hayes saw faces in the spray. Martha Hargrove, the daughters, all pale and hollow-eyed, reaching upward. Then the ground swallowed the well completely. They didn't stop until dawn. Exhausted, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley. The smoke from Marlowe's crossing rose in the distance, twisting upward like a dark hand. Naomi held the babies close, whispering a prayer. "We can't keep running," she said softly. "He'll find us no matter where we go." Hayes didn't answer. He looked west, toward the endless plains. His hands trembled. "He wants the children," he said finally. "If we can understand why, if we can find what binds him, we might break the curse." Naomi looked at him, her face streaked with tears. "And if we can't?" Hayes stared at the horizon. "Then we make sure it ends with us." The babies stirred. One giggled softly, the sound innocent and chilling all at once. Naomi looked down. "They've stopped crying," she whispered. But when Hayes turned, his breath caught in his throat. Both babies were holding hands, and in the dirt beside them, two tiny footprints appeared, leading away from the wagon into the tall grass. He followed them with his eyes, but they faded into nothing, disappearing as if swallowed by the earth. Naomi began to weep quietly. Hayes reached for her hand. "Whatever this is," he said, his voice low, "we face it together." Far in the distance, thunder rolled across the sky. The wind carried a single word, faint but clear. "Home." Hayes looked back toward Waverly. The curse was calling them home. "Would you like me to continue with Part 9, Ware Drive?" Hayes and Naomi returned to Waverly to confront the curse at its birthplace, the ruins of the Hargrove Ranch and the final well beneath it. Hook. The further they ran from Waverly, the louder the whispers became. Every mile they traveled, every sunrise they survived, something unseen followed close behind. Dr. Hayes believed he could escape the evil of Josiah Hargrove, but he was wrong. Some curses are not bound by distance. They are bound by blood. Part 9. By late August of 1854, Drive. Hayes and Naomi had reached the far edge of the Texas frontier, near the foothills of the Pecos River. The land was dry and wild, the kind of place where a man could disappear. Hayes thought that might be their salvation. But every night, when the wind shifted, he heard that faint, dreadful hum. It was the sound that had followed them from the well at Marlowe's crossing, the same whisper that had haunted Naomi's dreams. Naomi grew weaker with each passing day. She barely ate, barely slept. The two infants, pale and silent, clung to her constantly. Hayes worried for her mind as much as her health. He saw her talking to the children when she thought he wasn't watching, whispering to them as if she were listening for answers. One night, he overheard her murmuring, "Father says we must go back." Hayes froze. He stepped closer to the campfire, watching her face flicker in the orange light. "Naomi," he said softly, "you mustn't listen to that voice. Your father is dead." She looked up slowly, her eyes dark and distant. "You don't understand, Doctor. He isn't dead, not the way you think." The next morning, she was gone. Hayes awoke to find the blankets empty, the children missing, and her footprints leading away from the camp, back east. He saddled the horse and rode after her, the desert wind stinging his eyes. For hours he followed the tracks until they vanished at the edge of a dry ravine. There, at the bottom, he saw Naomi sitting on the ground, rocking the babies and humming that same hymn from the Hargrove home. "Naomi," he shouted, "you can't go back. He'll destroy you." She looked up at him, tears streaking her face. "He already has," she whispered. "The only way to end this is to return." Hayes climbed down, desperate. "We can fight it, Naomi. Together." She shook her head. "You can't fight what's inside you, Doctor." Before he could stop her, she rose, clutching the children, and walked into the ravine's shadows. The earth trembled beneath his feet, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Hayes heard crying, dozens of voices, wailing together like a buried chorus. Then silence. When the dust cleared, Naomi and the children were gone. Only the imprint of small hands remained in the sand. Hayes collapsed to his knees. He felt the full weight of despair settle over him. He had tried to save her, but the curse had claimed her like all the others. Still, as he looked eastward, toward the horizon, he knew what he had to do. The voices wanted him to return. So he would, not to surrender, but to end it once and for all. The journey back to Waverly took 4 days. The sky turned gray with storms, and by the time he reached the familiar fields, the land looked changed, withered, abandoned, lifeless. The Hargrove ranch stood like a tomb, its windows shattered, its roof half collapsed. The smell of decay hung in the air. Hayes tethered his horse and stepped inside. The house was silent except for the soft dripping of water somewhere below. He followed the sound into the cellar, lantern in hand. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. Then he saw it, the well. It had no rope, no bucket, just a wide mouth of blackness breathing a faint mist into the room. He knelt beside it, peering down. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, from the depths, 2 eyes opened, pale, ghostly eyes that glowed faintly in the lantern light. "Dr. Hayes," came the voice, low and steady. "You have come home." Hayes staggered back. "You're not real," he said. "You died." The voice laughed softly. "Death is for the faithless. I am eternal, for I am the father of my blood, and through them, I live." The mist rose higher, swirling around the cellar. Faces formed within it, Ruth, Naomi, the other daughters, all whispering his name. Their voices overlapped, pleading and singing and crying all at once. Hayes dropped to his knees. "What do you want from me?" "The same thing I have always wanted," the voice said. "Obedience. You came to heal, but you brought the sickness with you. You carried it when you left. It's inside you now, Doctor. My gift." Hayes felt a searing pain in his chest. He tore open his shirt and saw faint, dark marks spreading across his skin, lines that pulsed like veins, forming symbols he recognized from Josiah's Bible. He screamed and stumbled back toward the stairs, but the door above had vanished. The cellar had no exit. Only the well remained. "You can't fight me," the voice said gently, almost like a father soothing a frightened child. "You can only join me." Hayes clutched the lantern. "If you live through blood," he said through gritted teeth, "then I'll burn the blood itself." With shaking hands, he poured the lantern oil across the floor. The mist shrieked and twisted as he struck a match. Flames roared to life, racing across the cellar walls. The faces in the smoke screamed as one. Hayes backed away, his skin blistering from the heat. "Burn, you monster!" he shouted. "Burn with your sins." The fire spread quickly, climbing the wooden beams, reaching the floor above. The house groaned and buckled. Hayes staggered to the far wall, feeling for any sign of escape. Then, through the fire's light, he saw a figure standing at the top of the cellar steps, Naomi, holding the 2 children. Her expression was calm, almost peaceful. "It's over, Doctor," she said softly. "Go. The fire will end it." He hesitated. "Naomi," she smiled faintly, "we're already gone." The flames closed in, swallowing the shadows. Hayes climbed through a broken window and fell into the dirt outside as the house erupted behind him. The roof collapsed with a deafening roar, sending sparks into the stormy sky. For a moment, he thought he saw the silhouettes of the Hargrove daughters in the firelight, standing together, their faces serene. Then the house was gone, consumed by flame. Hayes lay there in the mud, watching until the fire died and the rain began to fall. The ground steamed, hissing softly. When morning came, the house was nothing but ashes. He turned away, ready to leave, but as he reached the gate, he heard a sound behind him, a soft cry, like a baby waking from sleep. Hayes froze. He turned slowly toward the ruins. From beneath the charred earth, the cry grew louder. Then another joined it, and another. He dropped to his knees, whispering, "Dear God, what have I done?" The soil shifted. Something was moving underneath. Hayes ran. He didn't look back. Not when the smoke rose again, not when the cries turned into laughter, and not when the faint voice of Josiah Hargrove followed him through the rain, whispering, "You can burn the house, doctor, but you cannot burn the blood." Would you like me to continue with part 10, the final part, Ware Drive? Hayes faces the horrifying truth about the Hargrove bloodline and the final curse that follows him even beyond death. Hook. When the fire died, Drive. Hayes thought the nightmare was over. But evil doesn't burn, it waits. The ashes of the Hargrove home were cold, yet something beneath them was still breathing. And as dawn broke over the blackened land, Hayes realized the curse hadn't ended. It had just changed its name, his. Part 10, final part. The storm rolled across the Texas plains, washing away the last of the fire's smoke. Dr. Hayes sat alone near the ruins. Trembling, his coat soaked and his mind drifting between sanity and madness. The Hargrove house was gone, burned to its bones, but the echoes of laughter still rippled through the air. He had seen too much to believe it was over. Naomi's face haunted him, her final words twisting in his ears. "We're already gone." What did that mean? Where had she gone? He rose, his legs weak, and walked back toward the smoldering remains. The rain had turned the ash into black mud. He knelt and brushed away a clump of it, and froze. Beneath his fingers was something soft. Flesh. He pulled harder and uncovered a small, pale hand. Then another. Then dozens, tangled together, reaching upward as if trying to escape. Hayes stumbled back, gagging. The earth was full of them. The Hargrove daughters. The missing women, all buried beneath the house, preserved by whatever dark ritual Josiah had performed. And then came the sound, a faint hum, deep and rhythmic, like a heartbeat beneath the ground. The same sound he'd heard in the well. Hayes staggered backward. No more. But the earth began to move. The burned soil cracked, and from the center of the ruin rose a shape. It wasn't Josiah, but it bore his face, part ash, part flesh, glowing with dim red light. Around it, hundreds of smaller shadows crawled from the mud, their eyes blank and white. "Welcome home, doctor," the voice said. "You tried to cure the disease, but you only fed it." Hayes grabbed the crucifix from his pocket, the one Naomi had once given him, and held it high. "I destroyed you. I burned your house to the ground." The figure stepped closer, grinning. "You burned wood and stone. But I was never in the house. I was in them." Hayes looked down in horror as the mud around him began to move again, this time, climbing his boots, his legs. It felt warm, alive, pulsing with every heartbeat. He screamed and fell to his knees, clawing at his skin. The symbols he thought had burned away were glowing once more, spreading up his arms. The voice grew louder, filling his mind. "The blood remembers, doctor. You carry it now." Hayes looked toward the rising sun and realized the truth. The curse hadn't died with Josiah. It had chosen a new vessel. Him. He drew his pistol, pressing it to his chest. "Then it dies with me," he said. The shadow laughed, soft and cruel. "You can't kill what's already inside you." Hayes pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the empty fields. Birds scattered into the morning sky. His body fell among the ruins, still, silent. For the first time in months, there was peace. Or so it seemed. As the sun climbed higher, the ground near his body began to stir. The blood that had spilled from his chest soaked into the soil, spreading like ink in water. The mud bubbled, and from it, a single pale flower pushed through, a white lily, trembling in the wind. By dusk, the flower had withered, its petals turning black. Weeks passed. The land healed. A new family eventually came to settle near the ruins, a farmer, his wife, and their infant daughter. They built a small cabin not far from where the Hargrove house once stood. The soil, they said, was rich and dark. Good for crops. The first harvest came quickly. The wheat grew tall and golden. But soon the family noticed strange things, shapes moving at night, whispers in the wind, the baby crying at shadows no one else could see. One evening, the farmer's wife found a book buried beneath the old well, its pages scorched but legible. Inside were prayers, written in a trembling hand, and drawings of symbols burned into flesh. The last page read, "The blood remembers. It waits beneath the soil." That night, the farmer awoke to the sound of humming. He thought it was the wind, until he looked at his wife's face. Her eyes were open, her lips were moving, and in her arms, the baby was smiling. The same song that Naomi once sang echoed softly through the house. And somewhere, far beneath the fields, the heartbeat began again. Call to action. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't let the darkness end here. Subscribe for more haunting tales from America's forgotten past. Share this story with someone brave enough to read it at night, and let us know in the comments, what do you think happened to Dr. Hayes's soul?